You're watching 345. I'm Jason Van Loo, and this is Level 4.
With HTML5 and CSS3, you've been coding up those websites functionally. We all know the secrets, now you can know too. So come on down and join Professor Jason Van Loo.
In this level, we're going to be focusing on content. Now, content can mean a lot of different things, but in this case, we're going to be referring to content as the inside of your site. So we're not going to be talking just about text content, but we're going to be looking more high level. So how your information is laid out and what sort of information you're including on each of your pages in order to optimize usability and ultimately optimize user experience for your site. So in this level, we're going to continue to use our case study website border and radius. But before we do that, let's go over a couple of points related to content. So first, you want to have a strategy. It's essential to have a content strategy for your site. You don't just want to put content on there without thinking about how that affects your users and how that affects your overall user experience. Second, you want to get an ID. Now what this means is information design is critical. How you lay out your information is just as important as what sort of information you're including on each page. Third, easy does it. Now just because you can use something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. So for example, just because you can use some of these great new CSS3 elements doesn't mean you always should use those on your page. You want to make sure that you're keeping your user in mind and making sure that everything that you do goes down to the bottom line, and that's affecting and optimizing your user experience. So just like we've been doing throughout this course, we're going to focus on three primary elements in this level: design, markup, and style. So let's go ahead and jump on over to the border and radius site and talk about some of the design strategy that we used to design the site. So we have a few content sections on this page. First, we have our main promotional area, which includes an image and some promotional copy highlighting the brewhouse's plethora of beer selections. Additionally, we have links to the two menus below. Now the strategy here is to create quick hit elements that give the user a sense of what border and radius is all about. By including a large image, large typographic elements, and large links to the menus, the user can quickly identify what this place is all about. We also have three content blocks beneath, which contain more important elements that the client wanted to feature. Border and radius is in the news a lot, so this section gives users a chance to see how it has been received in the community. They also have a pretty sweet lunch special running, so that needs some prominence. And border and radius is a lot of e-marketing, so the client wanted to make sure that an email sign-up was prominent and easy to use. Throughout a pretty simple grid layout, we're able to accommodate the major features of the site with a little bit of flair, namely in the beer selection highlighting and top promo section. So let's move on to the markup for this section. So for our markup, we're going to start with this section that you see here. We have a large image, then we have a section to the right which contains some important information about their beer selections, and then we have two key buttons that link to the food menu and the beer menu. So previously, before HTML5, we might have marked up this section like this. We have our div ID promotional with our large image there, and then we have an unordered list contained within a div ID selections that showcases the beer selection. Now I want to call your attention to a couple of those elements that are within italic and span classes. Now we'll get to those later when we actually style this section. Finally, our two menu buttons below are going to be included within two anchors. So how might we change this to HTML5? Well, it's actually a pretty simple change in this case. Since this is a grouping of related content, we can go ahead and replace our div with a section. So in this case, we're going to add our HTML section tag in place of our div ID promotional, and there we go. Let's take a look at our markup in the browser. So it's nice and clean and semantic in HTML5. So let's move on to our block elements underneath our promotional section. So as you can see, we have three boxes: our latest news, current specials, and email newsletter box. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we might mark up latest news. Well, first we have a containing element, div ID blocks. Now I won't be referring to that as we move forward, but just wanted you to know that that's there as a containing element. So previously we might have marked up our news box like so, with a div ID news, an H2 for the title of that box, and then each news item we might have marked up with the class. So in this case, div class news item with the title of the news item and then the actual content beneath it. So in HTML5 we're going to make a couple of changes that will help to organize our markup a little bit better. First, we can go ahead and replace our div ID news with sections because this is once again a grouping of related content. Next, we're going to add our header tag in place of our H2. So in this case, we're going to add our header tag with an H1 with the title latest news. Now, each news item is an independent composition. So if you remember before when we were talking about HTML5 tags, we talked about the article tag. This is a great place to go ahead and use that tag. So we're going to replace our div class news item with an article tag. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is, since we have a title within each news item or within each article, we can go ahead and add another header element with an H1. So if you remember, I mentioned before that you can use HTML5 elements like the header tag in multiple areas of your page. And you can see as we've marked up this site, we've actually used the header tag quite a bit. Now, that does mean that we have a lot of header tags and H1s. Now, that may or may not be a good thing. It's still semantic HTML5, but if you're more comfortable using some of the older practices in HTML like H2s and H3s, that's totally fine too. It's still going to be semantic. I just wanted to show you where you could apply some of these new tag elements, just so you can see how you might be able to do it in the future. So the final thing that we're going to do to this section in HTML5 is we can actually introduce a new tag element. In this case, it's going to be the time tag. Now this is a pretty cool little tag because before we might have marked up the, in this case, the published date and where it was published for the actual article in a paragraph or a span tag. Now we can use the HTML5 time tag to actually give a little bit more information to the browser about what we're rendering here. The HTML5 tag element is made up of two versions. One is human readable, so in this case it would be our Monday, January 26th, 2011, and then the other is machine readable. And this is done in ISO format, so we're going to have our year, month, and day in that order. And you could also add hours, minutes, seconds if you wanted to, but we're not going to do that here. So you can see in our code that we've added time, date time in the ISO format, 2011-01-26, and then we've also added pub date to the end of that string. Now what does that do? Well, in this case, since it's an article, pub date tells the browser that this is the actual published date of the article, as opposed to just a generic time or date. So this is great if you're doing news posts or actual articles, because you can go ahead and tell the browser in your markup that this is an actual published date. Now that we've marked up our latest news, let's go ahead and mark up our current specials box. Now this is a pretty straightforward piece of markup here, so I won't spend too much time on it. But previously, before HTML5, we might have marked it up to look something like this. We have our div ID specials, just like before we had our latest news. We have our H2 with the title, and then we have our image with paragraph copy underneath. So how might we change this to HTML5? Well, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to replace our div with a section once again because it's a grouping of related content. And then next, we're going to add our header tag in place of the H2 for current specials. So the final piece of markup would be our email newsletter box. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and leave that to the next level where we can spend a little bit more time talking about the new elements in HTML5 forms. So now that we've marked up our first two boxes, let's go ahead and move into style. Alright, so let's review just a little bit about what we're going to be styling. First, we're going to style our promotional area like you see here. So if you can remember, we have our large image, we have our beer selections copy, and then we have our two menu items. So let's go ahead and get our basic styles out of the way first, like you see here. Now, what we're going to do with our image is we're actually going to add a box shadow to sort of set it out of the page a little bit more and help to match the rest of the styling in the site. So in this case, we're going to use our vendor prefixes first and add a box shadow like you see here. Let's take a look at how that might render in the browser. Now we could leave our image just like that, but let's go ahead and add a hover state. We're going to use our new CSS3 transform property, and we're going to use the code like you see here. So in this case, we're going to scale the image by 10%, 1.1, and we're actually going to rotate it -2 degrees. So in this case, we're going to rotate it to the left. And remember, with the CSS3 transform property, you're actually not going to affect the other elements surrounding the image. So we're actually going to get a hover state that looks like this. It's a way to interact with the image a little bit more without negatively affecting the rest of your site, which is pretty cool. Now let's move on to our copy, highlighting the beer selections at border and radius. Now before I might have used images to render what you see here, but thanks to CSS3 we can now render this natively in the browser. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we might do that. First, let's recall our markup. So in this case we have an unordered list with 3 list items. And once again, remember I mentioned let's take note on the italic and span classes that we have in each of those, because we're going to be styling those individually to create some cool effects. So here are our basic styles. Now if you notice, we're going to use League Gothic again, which we font faced earlier, and we're also going to add a text shadow. In this case we're going to add a letterpress effect like we talked about before to sort of have the text sit inside of the page. Alright, so let's take a look at how that renders. Now the first image is our styles before we added any of our CSS3 properties, and the second image is what it looks like after we've added our font face and our text shadow. So this looks good, but I'd like to be able to do something a little bit more to the text. And if you remember, our on is actually sitting within an italic element. So let's go ahead and style that a little bit more. So in this case we're going to use a different font, Marketing Script Regular, which we font faced earlier. So now if we take a look at how that renders in the browser, you can see that we have a nice subtle little effect on the on portions of our copy, which helps to set it apart even more. Finally, we're going to style the actual numbers of this section. So here you can see how our styles might be coded out. Once again, we're going to use League Gothic, but in this case we're going to increase the font size to 75 pixels. Now additionally, we've added another class to the middle list item just to make sure that it aligns properly. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that renders in the browser. So the first image you see is our styles without our CSS3 properties added in, and the second image is after we've added our CSS3 properties. So this is pretty cool because previously we would have only been able to do this with images. Now we can do this natively in CSS3 and create some pretty cool effects and an optimal user experience. Alright, finally we're going to style our 2 menu item buttons. So let's go ahead and recall our markup to make sure we understand what we're working with here. So if you remember, we have our 2 anchor elements that are virtually the same, so that's nice. Let's go ahead and take care of our basic styles first. So here they are, and one thing to take note of is you can notice in our background we've set our RGBA color, but we've also set an opacity value of 0.5. Now later on we're going to set a hover state because these are links, and we're actually going to make this image a little bit less opaque. So we'll get to that in a minute. So let's take a look at how our buttons render with just these basic styles added. Alright, so let's get a little crazy with CSS3. So in this case we're going to add rounded corners again, but we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're only going to round the top left and bottom right corners of these buttons. So we're going to add code that looks like this. We have our vendor prefixes first and then our standard properties. But you can see that instead of just saying border radius, we've actually declared which corner we want to round. So in this case, top left and bottom right, and we've given a value of 10 pixels for each. Additionally, we're going to add a text shadow to our text to give it that letterpress effect once again. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that renders, and as you can see, we no longer have just basic rectangles. We're able to round certain corners of the image, which is kind of neat. It's a little bit different than going ahead and rounding all of the corners. Alright, so we're not quite done. Finally, we're going to add a transition to our menu buttons. So in this case, we're going to set our vendor prefixes first with our standard property after, and we're going to transition all of the elements, so the button and the text included in the button. We're going to do that for 0.3 seconds, and we're going to use our default ease in out function. We're also going to add our hover state with the styles that you see here. Now remember I mentioned before that our static state had an opacity value of 0.5. Now we're going to add an opacity value of 0.9. So the static state of the button is actually more opaque, and when you roll over it, it's going to become less opaque, which is going to be kind of a neat little rollover effect that you can do with just a few easy CSS3 properties. Let's go ahead and add a few more styles to our text. So in this case we have a span element in our text on the button, and we're going to add marketing script as the font for that element. And then lastly we're going to add a pseudo class to the right button just to make sure that it aligns properly with the rest of our elements. So let's go ahead and take a live look in the browser at how all of this renders. So we have our large promo image, and you can see the rollover effect we added with our transform property. Additionally, we have our beer selections copy styled with @fontface and text shadow, and our menu buttons provide clear call to action points with great CSS3 properties, including this smooth transition that we created for the hover state. Okay, so now that we're done styling our promotional section, let's go ahead and move on to our block elements underneath. So first, let's look at the basic styles that we're going to use to style some of the shared elements that each of these boxes have. Alright, so here are our basic styles. So we have our blocks containing element, we have our section, we have a pseudo class for the last box in this section, and then we also have our shared titles across all three boxes, which in this case we're going to go with marketing script regular. So let's go ahead and focus now on the latest news box and look how we might style that. So let's go ahead and recall our markup for this particular box. We have our section ID news, we have our header for the title latest news, and then we have our various news items or articles. Alright, so first we're going to get our basic styles out of the way that pretty much just styles out the text in each one of our articles. So you can see how we might style those here. Let's go ahead and take a look at how that might render in the browser. So the first image that you see is before we've added these properties, and the second image is after we've added some of these new properties to our elements. Alright, now we could stop there, but we're actually going to create a pretty cool little hover state for each of our articles. So let's look at the basic style that we're going to need. Now, one thing I want to call your attention to in this case is the width property. Currently it's at 285 pixels. Now for our rollover state, we're actually going to create a rollover effect in which the background extends out of the containing box. So just want you to keep that width in mind. We'll come back to it in a minute. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add rounded corners. But just like our menu buttons in our promotional section, we're not going to round every corner. In this case, we're only going to round the corners on the right side, so the top right and the bottom right. And we would do this by providing the code like this. We have our vendor prefixes and then our standard properties, and in this case we have top right and bottom right with a radius of 5 pixels. So next we're going to add a transition. Now we could just use a basic hover state, so when you roll over that particular item it would just have a standard rollover effect. But with CSS3 we can create pretty cool transitions for our hover states. So that's what we're going to do here. And we're actually going to create 2 transitions. So the first that we're going to do is transition the width. We're actually going to have the background break outside of the containing box. And then the second thing we're going to do is have the background transition as well. So here's the code that we're going to use to make that happen. Our first transition involves the width, and we're going to say linear because we want it to happen on a linear model. And the second transition that we're going to use is we're actually going to transition the background. In this case, we're going to have it ease. Finally, we're going to add our hover state, and in this case, we're going to add an opacity value of 0.5. Now, if you remember, our background previously didn't have any color. It was just the standard background of the containing element. In this case, we want to add a color so that when you hover over it, the background can transition into a color, but we'd like to keep it semi-opaque so that it brings out some of the texture from the underlying elements. So let's go ahead and take a live look at how that renders to give you a good idea of what we can accomplish with CSS3. First, let's take a quick look at our news section without all of the CSS3 properties that we added in. Now you can see it's fairly basic and kind of boring, to be honest. Now let's see how much better this section looks by adding a few simple CSS3 properties. And check out the nifty hover effect that we added through CSS transitions. We're able to break the confines of the box, we've got rounded corners, and we've got our opacity value that really helps to spruce up this section. Alright, so our last task is to style the current special section. Now let's go ahead and recall our markup. And if you can remember, it's pretty straightforward. We have our section, our header, our image, and then we have our paragraph copy underneath. So let's go ahead and get our basic styles out of the way. And as I mentioned, these are pretty straightforward. But one thing we want to focus on is the image. Now we could leave the images static, but let's go ahead and add a pretty cool hover effect. So in this case, we're going to do a similar thing like we did with our promotional image above, and we're going to add a CSS transform property. We're going to rotate it -5 degrees. So in this case, when we hover over it, it's going to rotate a little bit to the left and just give a nice subtle user experience factor. And let's go ahead and check out what that looks like when you hover over this element. Alright, so let's go back to our border and radius site and do a quick review of all of the elements that we styled and marked up in this level. Alright, so let's do a quick review here. We have our promo section with our large promo image and its nifty little hover state that we created. We have our beer selections elements rendered in rich web fonts. We have our menu buttons with rounded corners, text shadow, and a nice smooth transition on hover. And as we move into our block elements, we've already hit on our news section and how much the CSS3 properties add to the overall experience, including that hover state. And then finally, we've got our specials section and our nifty little hover state for our image. We've managed to create a rich user experience with just a few subtle effects in CSS3 and effectively organized our markup using HTML5. Alright, so now it's time for you to apply what you've learned in this level. So let's go ahead and jump into the code.